Hi, my name is Madeline, and I'd like to share with you today on the topic of being courageous. Sometimes when we think of courage, we think of incredible individuals doing amazing things that are so extraordinary, and their display and courage of doing these incredible things, just as it's very different than the average person in society today. And maybe some of us look back and we're quite content to let other people be courageous. We'll sit back and we'll relax in comfort and safety and security, not looking to adopt any of that courage in our life and live in an extraordinary way. But is that God's plan for us as Christians? No, God wants us to be courageous people, but not courageous reckless, just courageous trusting in Him, walking our lives out and according to the plans and purposes that He has for us. Maybe some courage to us is being stretched to ask us to pray for someone who's sick, that they may be made well. Maybe that requires the courage that it just has to be stirred up for your life to be extraordinary. Maybe it's sharing with someone who doesn't have a relationship with Jesus what Jesus has done in your life. That takes courage and maybe just a real stretch of maybe where you're comfortable in your life today. Maybe it's facing injustice that's going on around the world by having a voice and putting a voice to a situation to stand up against something that's going on that's wrong. Whatever it is that God's calling you to do, it takes courage to be able to step into that situation and be stretched, trusting that God is meeting you there. What can get in the way of us being courageous Christians often is when we start performing a risk assessment. A risk assessment is what I would call when you start sitting there looking at the consequences of what is being required of you and whether or not you're prepared to deal with those consequences. When you look at a risk assessment online, you'll see the process looking like this: identifying the hazards, deciding who might be harmed and how, evaluating the risks and decide on precaution, and then record your findings and implement them. And all of that can be really good if you're in a work situation, or maybe you're dealing with almost any situation really. In the natural, you have to look at the pros and cons to that decision and go in with your eyes wide open, you would say. But how does that work with God? You see, the thing is, when God asks us to do something, His ways are not our ways. So risk assessment based on our knowledge and understanding is likely going to fall short on the actual end result, because we can't see what God's going to do in a situation when He asks us to do something and it stretches us because we can't see how that's going to happen. It doesn't mean it can't happen. It just means our risk assessment isn't going to be able to cover what God's able to do that supersedes what we could do naturally. Maybe what you can do naturally is not something that is going to actually fit the bill for what God has in mind for that situation. So you have to trust that He knows the beginning from the end and do it His way, and just take that step and be courageous in following Him and the instructions that He's giving you for that situation. Joshua 1, verse 6 to 9 tells us, "Be strong and courageous, because you will lead these people to inherit the land I swore to their forefathers to give them. Be strong and very courageous. Be careful to obey the law my servant Moses gave you. Do not turn from it to the right or to the left, that you may be successful wherever you go. Do not let this book of the law depart from your mouth. Meditate on it day and night, so that you will be careful to do everything written in it. Then you will be prosperous and successful. Have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous. Do not be terrified. Do not be discouraged, for the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go." It's the same promise to us today. God desires for us to be strong and courageous, and that He won't depart from us, that He'll be with us wherever we go. If He's asking you to do something that makes you have to stir up courage, trust Him. That's the key. We have to trust Him and walk in obedience and go in His timing and in the methods that He's calling us. You see, there can be courage and recklessness that go hand in hand together when you're just courageous in tackling situations, but you're not waiting on God and you're going off on your own. And that recklessness can basically have you right out of His timing and put you in a situation that really maybe doesn't have the end result that you're hoping for. We have to be in alignment with what God's calling us to do and walk in His timing. When we look at a situation that is very similar as to what I was describing, it was when the Israelites wandered in the desert and it came time for them to cross over into the Promised Land. They came to a crisis in their faith and they didn't trust God after hearing the report of the 10 spies of these giants that inhabited the land and how they would never be able to take over that land. They didn't trust God, and they didn't step across and trust Him to make it an opportunity work out for them. And because of that, they ended up wandering the desert for another 40 years. We know that God's best for them was that they would enter the promised land, and when they realized what they had lost out on, they decided to stir up that courage in them and just do it. But then now, as Moses told them at that time in Numbers, Moses told them, don't go, God's not going to go with you. The time has passed, and now you're going on your own. And indeed they did go on their own, and they ended up losing the battle and having to come back in defeat. There is a timing and there is a method, and both require us to listen and follow God and walk in obedience to Him. When we do it God's way, then we end up seeing the things come together the way that God intended. He knows the plans and purposes He has for you and I. And there's times where we have to stir up the courage and just walk in that obedience without doing a risk assessment that could basically cause us to turn away from the plan that God has and try to do self-preservation. You could live a small life. You could live a life that is not filled with courage and have nothing to be able to hear, well done, my good and faithful servant, if you're sitting there only worrying about your self-preservation and keeping your life safe from courage. I encourage you to be courageous Christians and go forward and do the things that God's calling you to do, trusting that He is there with you. Thank you, and have a great day.